Welcome to the RIDE pre-recorded training on the new CACFP budget template. This new template is required for all new submissions for FY21. This training will walk through the new budget Excel template and we'll walk through each tab and how it should be completed. So the first tab that we're on is the Instructions tab. The Instructions tab should be the first place you review when starting your budget. It includes valuable instructions, best practices, and links to required documents down here. On this tab, don't forget to include the name and contact information for the person completing this budget. There are also many certifications that are required on the Instructions tab. You're required to certify that you have read and you're responsible for complying with the annual CACFP budget guidance, which is a RIDE created document, which is down here. It's basically a high-level overview of the budgeting process. You're also required to certify via this drop-down, it's just a yes, that you've read and you're responsible with complying with FNS Instruction 796-2, Revision 4, and the USDA Guidance for Management Plans and Budgets. So all of the links are included down here. Together, all 4 of these documents will provide you with the guidance needed to complete the budget. Next, we're going to move on to the Income tab. As a reminder, areas highlighted in blue, any cell in blue, that's a data entry cell. Cells in white are either a formula cell like this one or non-entry fields. On the Income tab, you're going to start with this sponsor information section. So this is where you'll enter in your name, agreement number, a date, and if you are a sponsoring organization, enter in the number of CACFP sites that you have. The next section, this projected CACFP income, is where you enter in your estimated CACFP reimbursement and cash in lieu commodity reimbursement. You can use the remittance listing report from CNP Connect to assist you with your estimate if you don't anticipate any significant changes in enrollment or meal service. Otherwise, if you do anticipate significant changes, you could use the estimated annual food program reimbursement worksheet that's found on the RIDE Child Nutrition Program CACFP section of the website. So as a reminder, the CACFP is a supplemental program and you may not have sufficient reimbursement to cover all expenses of running the CACFP. If your budgeted CACFP expenses exceed your CACFP reimbursement, you must list unrestricted non-program funds available to fund this deficit. And this is where you would enter the information. So you would enter the source, the amount, and any explanation that you think would be helpful for RIDE reviewers. Unrestricted funds could be funds that are available for any purpose and can include Head Start funds, tuition, parent fees, unrestricted earnings. Entering information here will serve to establish fiscal viability of the CACFP in your program. I do want to note if you don't complete the section and you have a CACFP deficit, we will not be able to approve the budget. It may be useful to complete the operating and administrative tabs and then revisit this section. Also, at the bottom of the schedule, you'll see that there's a Schedule A total income. All of the totals from the projected income and the unrestricted non-CACFP funds flow to this section. You'll see that it's white, so it is a formula cell. You don't enter anything in that. This is going to be the same type of format for the operating and administrative tab. There's going to be a summary schedule at the bottom. Next, we're going to pan over to the operating tab. The operating tab is where you're going to have the bulk of your costs. The minimum required section on this tab is 3, purchase food costs. The other sections may or may not apply to your organization. Don't feel obligated to complete every section. Remember, you are not reimbursed by line item. Some high-level items before we dive in. You'll notice that we're asking for a lot more detail and a lot more supporting information than we have in the past. This is to ensure that we are in line with regulation as required by USDA and to minimize back and forth requests. It'll be an adjustment to get through this process in the first year, but our hope is that it will make the process more efficient on a go forward. So each section is going to have a brief description of giving you some more information. While completing the budget, I would also open up the RIDE procedures for the annual budget, as this has line by line, section by section instructions on how the budget should be completed. It'll also give you more information about the nature of the expenses, and it's just very detailed. It'll also give you the supporting documentation that's needed. Back to the operating tab. Here also, within each section, highlighted in bold and red includes the supporting documentation that you're going to need for every section. And this is going to be every section on the operating and administrative task. Also, most items will require you to have an allocation percentage, the percentage allocated to CACFP. You'll also need to include in the sponsor explanation cell the rationale for how you came up with that percentage. Alternatively, you can also submit that as a separate document. So we're going to start with one of the most important costs, food. We're expecting purchase food costs to be a significant portion of your budget, at least 40 to 50%. A couple items to note here. If you have vended meals, you must have an approved and fully executed contract on file with RIDE. If your organization is self-prep, you must provide support for how you came up with your food costs. Next, we're going to move on to equipment. If applicable, you can add in equipment or durable supplies under $5,000 you are planning to purchase with CACFP funds. This could include items like a fridge, small appliances, stove, etc. that's under $5,000. I do want to note you cannot include equipment purchased in the past in this section. You will also need to include detailed information about the equipment to be purchased and ensure you follow all applicable procurement regulations. You must have the specific equipment in mind in order for this section to be approved. Also, if it's not fully allocable to the CACFP, you have to enter in the percent allocated to CACFP and in the sponsor explanation section, the rationale for how you came up with that allocation percentage. Next, equipment over $5,000. This is considered to be a capital expenditure and can only be charged to the program via depreciation expense. The formula in this section is set up to be straight line depreciation. If you're using any other method of depreciation, it requires specific prior written approval. Refer to FNS Instruction 796-2 Revision 4 for more guidance on charging depreciation to the CACFP. The next section, non-food supplies, is a section that will apply to most of you. This is where you would include your non-food supplies such as dish detergent, cleaning supplies, food storage supplies, etc. Be specific with what you're including and make sure that you include your allocation percentage, and in the sponsor explanation cell, include your the allocation methodology. Next is labor. So I do want to point out that we've really changed the way that labor costs are presented in the budget. It's no longer by employee name, but by employee position. This should result in less line items if you have multiple people in the same position. For example, if you have 2 teachers that serve meals, you now only need 1 line item that encompasses both of them, as long as the pay rates are the same. Continuing with this example, we're going to complete this section together. We're going to assume the number of personnel in this position is 2. We're also going to assume that the program months are going to be 12, and we're going to put in an hourly wage of 12. I do want to note, if 2 individuals have different hourly wages, you'll need separate line items. But for this example, they're going to have the same hourly wage. Next, we're going to input the hours spent a month in total for 1 teacher. I'm going to assume 160 hours, assuming a 40-hour work week, and 60 hours for the CACFP. I'm assuming 4 weeks in a month, for example. It's okay if the salary amount varies slightly. What's key in this example is that the allocation percentage is accurate and the salary is reasonable. I do want to note, do not multiply the hours or the hourly wage by the number of personnel. Enter the information assuming one person is in the position. The formula is set up to multiply by the number of personnel in the position. Next, I'm going to put in average benefits. I'm just going to put in 125. And like I mentioned before, this monthly and this annual is automatically taking the number of personnel and multiplying it by 2. Before we move forward, I'd like to go more into depth about the allowable items that you can include in the benefits cell. Allowable CACFP benefits can include health benefits, sick leave, vacation leave, life and disability insurance. You can also include federal, state, and local payroll taxes, including Social Security and unemployment. The next cell, specific CACFP job duties. This is a very important cell, and it must describe the CACFP duties. For example, let's say you have a teacher that's involved in meal service. In this column, you would include serving meals and taking meal counts. Similarly, if this position was for a director, you would specifically describe the director's CACFP function. Also, you'll notice that in bold and in red, the supporting documentation required is job descriptions of all the positions listed below. The job descriptions must break out the approximate percentages for each responsibility. So whatever's on the job description must align with this allocation percentage that you are putting in here. I also want to highlight something else about this labor section. You want to make sure that on the operating tab, you only include hours spent on operating tasks. If this position also has administrative tasks, you would want to enter that on the administrative tab. You don't want to double count the same hours on both of these tabs. For example, let's say we have a cook allocated 100% to CACFP under operating. That time shouldn't also be included on the administrative tab. Clear this out. Doesn't mess this up anywhere. The next section we have is contracted services. If you have an operating contracted service you're including in the budget, this will require specific prior written approval, and a copy of the contract needs to be provided with your budget. Note, this is only for non-food contracts. For purchased food contracts, that would be entered up here in section 3. Examples of operating contracted services can include equipment rental or maintenance contracts, janitorial contracts, trash removal, and independent contractors who provide nutritional services. One note about labor and independent contractors. If you issue an individual a 1099, the individual is an independent contractor and not an employee. The individual cannot be listed in the labor section and must be in the contracted service section, and you must receive specific prior written approval. Next, we're going to move on to other operational costs. Section 8A for miscellaneous food service expenses. This is not very common. However, you can use this section for any other allowable expense that you don't see fit anywhere else. You can please refer to the annual procedure with the step-by-step instructions for examples of costs that can be entered here. In section 8B, you would enter in mileage for CACFP food transportation costs and staff training. Note, if you're claiming mileage, it has to be at a rate that's lower than the IRS rate, equal or lower than the IRS rate, and you have to keep a mileage log, and you're required to certify that you will keep a mileage log for documentation. Another section that we changed from the prior version is facilities and utilities. The percentage allocable to the CACFP is calculated within this spreadsheet and will flow to the appropriate cells. You must complete this section starting at I-136 if you're planning to allocate facilities or utilities costs. And if you don't complete all required cells, it's not going to calculate correctly. CACFP regulations require that facilities or utilities are allocated both by square footage and program time versus total time used. I want to walk through an example of how this should be completed together. So we're going to say it's open for 52 weeks a year. We're going to say the center is open for 50 hours a week. We're going to assume that the center is 1,000 square feet and you have a kitchen that's 300 square feet and your food storage area is 100 square feet. Then you'll notice that there's this other cell. This won't really be a common cell, but let's say, for example, you don't have a kitchen, but you use your classroom to serve meals and store food. You could enter that square footage here. Make sure you enter in a description so that we can know what exactly this other represents. The next step is to enter in the hour per week that it's used for CACFP service. We're going to say the kitchen is used 15 hours a week, and for food storage area, we're going to say it's used for 5 hours a week. So you'll see down here in I-151 that now it's calculated a percentage of facility expenses allocable to the CACFP. Next, we're going to go through and we're going to enter in a lease expense. So we're going to go through and say it's a rental lease from the drop down. We'll just say it's ABC Corp. And the monthly cost is $3,000. So then you'll see the annual cost is multiplied out 12 months in a year. Percentage allocated to the CACFP just flows from what we went through, and then it'll give you the total cost of the CACFP. A very important question, are utilities or other items included in the lease? You have to indicate what other items, for example, of the utilities are included in the lease. And you cannot separately list other items in this utility section down here if it's already included in the lease. Another item to note is that if the building is owned by the institution, you cannot simply add your mortgage expense and allocate it. For owned buildings, you are limited to depreciation over a 30-year life. Refer to the detailed procedures file for more guidance. The last item that I want to bring up about utilities and facilities is that you don't want to double count the same lease expense on both the operating and administrative tabs. For most organizations, I would expect that the facilities is going to be operational. Then in this utilities, you can include utilities that are not included in the rental lease cost above. It's going to use the same calculation, the same allocated percent that we calculated up here. Another thing I want to know is waste. It would be appropriate to include it in either the utility section or the contracted services section. The allocation percentage calculated based on square footage may not accurately portray benefits usage by the program. If this is the case, you can include it in contracted services. And then, as I mentioned before, this Schedule B, it's going to be a summary schedule, and none of this is a data entry field. It's all formula driven. Next, we're going to move on to the administrative tab. The administrative tab is set up very similarly to the operating tab, so I'm pretty much going to breeze through this. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. There's going to be a labor section. You'd complete the labor section like you did in the operating tab. Make sure you don't double count time that's in the operating tab in the administrative tab. Next, we have the contracted services. The same rules apply as discussed on the operating tab. This will require specific prior written approval. Common examples might be office equipment lease, rental, accounting service, etc. I'm really not going to spend too much time on these other administrative costs either, set up very similarly, mileage, facilities. I want to reiterate that for facility and utility costs on this tab, it's for office administrative space only. Facility expenses related to the operation of the food service should be listed on the Operations tab. This section, for example, might be used by a sponsoring organization of centers that rents office space for its operation of the CACFP. Or in some less common cases, a sponsor may have facility expense in both operating and administrative if in the same building they have office space and a kitchen and classroom that they use for the CACFP. So you'll see facilities, utilities set up very similarly, and then Schedule C at the bottom summarizes all the information. Next, we're going to move on to the Summary tab. All information entered in on the income and the operating and administrative tabs all flow to this section. A few items I want to point out here. Be sure to list the funding source and amount available of non-program funds that are available to pay for overclaims or other unallowable costs. You also must certify in the drop-down box here that the information entered on the previous pages of the budget and summarized here is complete and accurate to the best of your knowledge. Column I is very important. This is where you'll indicate if the budgeted amount will be paid with CACFP funds. If you select no, you cannot use your CACFP reimbursement to support these costs. If an expense is included in the budget to give the sponsor a better idea of true cost of operating the CACFP, but that expense is not marked as funded with CACFP dollars, then it's considered to not be an allowable program expense. Similarly, if you don't fund it with CACFP funds, you also won't need to provide supporting documentation. So, and this is just a drop down where you would put yes or no. The next few tabs that I'm going to go over are the summary of supporting docs. This is an important tab and it's a required tab. This tab should be used as a checklist. You should review which line items you included in the budget and ensure you're providing the required documentation. You're going to indicate in column F if you provided this information. Remember, this documentation should be emailed to your RIDE CACFP renewal contact, and your budget cannot be approved until sufficient documentation has been received. The next few tabs that I'm going to go over may not apply to everyone. Starting with the documentation tab, this is required if your budget includes a cost that requires specific prior written approval. So for example, when I was talking about contracted services. Less than arm's length transactions also require specific prior written approval. And it would be this section down here that you would complete for less than arm's length transactions. If we pan over to tab H, this lists costs that require additional approvals. So this is directly from the FNS Instruction 796-2 Revision 4, and I recommend consulting this tab just to confirm whether or not you need specific prior written approval. Next, we're going to come over to this tab. For a less than arm's length rental cost, regulation limits the amount that can be charged to the CACFP to the amount that applies from applying a 30-year life expectancy to the property's acquisition cost less the value of the land. This tab will assist you in calculating what you can apply to the program. You'll need to provide documentation that supports the acquisition cost and the value of the land. So if we come down here, this allocation of facility costs to CACFP, it's the same formula that we went through on the operating tab. So this will help you get your allocation percentage that you can allocate to CACFP. And then after completing this section, you would go back to the operating section. Here, instead of rental lease, you would choose less than arm's length, and then you would go in and you would put in the required information. One thing to note is that here you'll need a monthly cost, and on the less than arm's length rental tab, it gives you an annual depreciation number. So you'll just want to divide this annual depreciation number by 12. And you'll also need to re-enter this information on the operating tab so that it calculates correctly. This annual depreciation expenses allocable to the CACFP will end up tying to total cost to CACFP here. That's an annual number. And then we touched on this tab already, but this is the last tab where it goes over all of the information that requires specific prior written approval. So this concludes our high-level walkthrough of the new CACFP budget template. If you have any questions related to this training or any other CACFP topic, please contact your RIDE program specialist.